Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Sky Island Coffee Break series. So glad you're joining us and happy September. Can't even believe it's September already, but yes, it is.
Rabbit, rabbit, rabbit.
I'm Amy Amoroso, Development Director for the Sky Island Alliance, and I'm so glad our speaker, Wynne Brown, can join us today, and I'm looking forward to learning more about Sara Plummer Lemmon. As folks are joining, feel free to put in the chat where you are joining us from. If you're joining us from Tucson or maybe somewhere out there in the nation, let us know where you're joining us from. And as a reminder to everyone, this talk is being recorded and live streamed as well. And after the meeting, usually by the end of today, but it depends on Rick's workload, we'll make the recording available to you via email as registrants, and then it'll also be up on our website for you to share with anyone you want. First of all, as we get started today, I'd like to acknowledge I'm speaking from Tucson, Arizona, where the Sky Island Alliance office is, and it is located on the traditional lands of the Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaki and other indigenous peoples of the region. So, if you are joining us today, you've probably heard about Wynne Brown's award-winning book, The Forgotten Botanist, Sara Plummer Lemmon's Life of Science and Art. Maybe you have even read the book. If not, definitely pick it up at a local bookstore, and we'll post some links at the end of the chat as suggestions of where to get it. Wynne Brown is a freelance writer, editor, graphic designer, and poet based in Tucson on the Arizona lands of the Tohono O'odham Nation and Pasquayaki tribe. This year, her most recent book, The Forgotten Botanist, Sara Plummer's Life of Science and Art, published by the University of Nebraska Press, was selected as the Southwest Books of the Year top pick and won the Spur Award for Best Western Biography and the Willa Literary Award for Creative Nonfiction. Congratulations to Wynne on all of those. Her other award-winning books include Remarkable Arizona Women, The Falcon Guide to Trail Riding Arizona, and Cave Creek Canyon, Revealing the Heart of Arizona's Chiricahua Mountains. She's also president of the Chiricahua Regional Council, the Pima County representative to the State Board of the Arizona Historical Society, and she was the 2022 Spring Pima County Public Library Writer in Residence. As a reminder, before we get to Wynne, we ask that you remain muted throughout the presentation and that you use the chat to type in questions that you have. After Wynne completes her presentation, we'll have a Q&A, which I'll moderate, and I'll be working from the chat, the questions that you put in the chat, to have that Q&A with Wynne. And now I'll turn this over to Wynne, and we're all looking forward to her presentation. Thank you for joining us.
Amy, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. At least I hope I am. We'll see if it works. And I'm hoping that you all can see the title slide. Is that working, Amy? Great, good.
Yes, it's working.
That's always comforting. Thank you so much for that really lovely introduction. And, you know, it's a huge kick and an honor to be here with Sky Island Alliance, as you saw from my shirt. There's also a fun connection. Not only did I spend several years as a tracker for Sky Island Alliance, but way back in 2012, I gave a talk on remarkable pioneer women of the Sky Islands. And it was while preparing for that talk that I learned that the Jepson Herbaria archives in Berkeley had 6 linear feet of material on the Lemmons. So going there was really the very beginning of this book. So it feels completely appropriate to be here. And let's see. And as Amy mentioned, I'm a writer, editor, and graphic designer. Basically, I think of myself as a three-legged stool, and these are just a few of the books and other projects that I've worked on as a writer, editor, illustrator, designer, or manager, or some combination. My background, kind of like Sarah's, is a mix of journalism, biology, and scientific illustration. But really, overall, I think of myself primarily as a storyteller. To me, stories are really the connective tissue that can attach us to our land or to our forebears or even to our entire culture, whether that be local or global. You can see more about the tools that I use to tell those stories at my website, and not surprisingly, that's wynnebrown.com. Also, not surprisingly, of all these projects on the previous slide, the project that I'm proudest of is this one. And this particular story of Sara Plummer Lemmon really connects art and science. To me, it's thrilling to see it arrive. The gestation period was 7 years. It's now been out for almost a year, and I'm pleased to tell you it's done really well. The entire first printing sold out in 6 months. So what are we going to do today? First, I'll give you a brief overview of the project itself. It's kind of the story behind Sarah's story. Then I'll zip through a bare bones timeline of Sarah's very packed life. And it's especially bare bones today because I want to focus more on her artwork, and especially the work that many of us thought had been lost in the San Francisco earthquake. This is the first time that some of the paintings that you're going to see have been seen in public since the late 1800s. We'll also look at a few of the plants that Sara either collected here in Southern Arizona, mostly in the Chiricahuas and the Huachucas, or that were named for her. And usually I read from the book, but again, because I'm so excited about these paintings that were just revealed 2 weeks ago, I'll share more of them instead. And then to wrap up, you'll see what's next, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end. When I first started all this, I really had no idea what I was getting myself into. It's hard to believe that it was 20 years ago that I first learned that Arizona's Mount Lemmon is named for a woman botanist of the 1800s who climbed it on her honeymoon in her 40s. And that was pretty intriguing. Then in 2012, when I learned about the 6 linear feet of material, my first thought was, somebody ought to do a book. Well, I now know there lie monsters in those words. It turns out that much of that 6 feet was letters, many, many letters. Talk about a gift to historians. Sara Plummer was very close to her family. She wrote home every week, mostly to her father and to her sister, who was named Maddie for Martha Plummer. I made 3 trips to Berkeley, the Berkeley archives, and photographed all 1,200 pages of Sara's letters. I then moved them onto my hard drive and read them all. And as you can see from this slide, sometimes that was a little challenging. Sara was a frugal type, and to save paper, she often wrote across her own handwriting. That was actually quite common at the time, and it's called cross-writing. This slide gets us a little deeper into the Plummer family history. You already know about Sara's sister, Maddie Everett. Well, Maddie had a daughter, Sara's niece, who confusingly was also called Maddie. Maddie Jr. married a man whose last name was St. John, and they had a son, Harold St. John, and he would have been Sara's grandnephew. Harold grew up to be a noted botanist in Hawaii, and when his mother died, boxes of Sara's paintings and letters ended up stored in his attic. When he died, his granddaughter, Amy St. John, did the best she could to conserve the material, and then she had it shipped from Honolulu to California. And in 2015, she donated all that material to the archives at Berkeley, and different boxes ended up stored in different sections within the facility. And here are 2 of those boxes. They're all watercolors on paper, and because of both their age and Hawaii's humidity, they're so fragile that the archivists were reluctant to even handle them, and they didn't even want to count them because they were afraid they would just crumble. In 2016, when this picture was taken, we all thought that that was the only surviving artwork of Sara's. And as of last week or 2 weeks ago, we now know we were wrong, and I'll get back to that. But to me, at the time, it was just tragic that these exquisite and incredibly fragile watercolors were crowded into these 2 boxes that were really too small for them. And, of course, times being what they are, particularly for archives, they had no money to do anything with them. Plus, I was really dying to see what was in those boxes. So a year later, in order to get photographs for the book that I had not yet written and didn't even have a contract for, I hired a local art conservator for a day, and this is Susan Filter. It was a very long day. At that point, we had no idea that there were 276 paintings packed into those 2 boxes. And Susan, my husband, Dave Peterson, and I spent hours listing and photographing every one of the 276 pieces, front and back, because there's often paintings or notes on the back. 20 of these paintings are reproduced in the book, in The Forgotten Botanist, and I'm happy to say they're reproduced in color. So I mentioned earlier that some of these paintings had been stored in Hawaii, and that much of the artwork is too fragile to handle. And you can certainly see this as an example of just horrific insect damage. And the day we saw those, I resolved that somehow I really wanted to make it possible for these delicate and exquisite paintings to be stored more safely. And this isn't really art restoration, because as you can see, there's not a lot left to restore on here. The accurate technical term for this is that the art needed to be stabilized and rehoused. So the next challenge was the book, and I'll spare you the nuts and bolts details about book publication, because that's a whole different talk, except to say that because it's nonfiction, publishers require a book proposal. And that's almost as much work as the eventual manuscript. Over the next 2 years, I submitted my proposal to 24 different agents, commercial publishers, and academic presses. And on October 2019, I signed a contract with the University of Nebraska Press. And the entire process with UNP has been absolutely fantastic. I'm especially pleased that the book is a Bison book, because that's their trade imprint for general interest readers. And then all I had to do was write the book. As you can tell, I have excellent office help. A year after submitting the final manuscript, in October last year, UPS delivered the first box of books, which was incredibly exciting. But 2022 has also been an exciting year. Thanks to an especially generous donation from the Sabino Canyon volunteer naturalists, along with other generous donations, and along with my speaking fees and honoraria, by this spring, there was enough funding for us to return to Berkeley and to cover Susan Filter's conservation fee and the materials for rehousing those 276 works. And then, amazingly, when we got there, it turns out that 2 more boxes that had been stored in other places within the archives had shown up. So the top photo up here shows these 2 are the original 2 smaller boxes. This is a 3rd box and a 4th one. And you'll hear more about that. In the lower left image, to the left here is Amy Kassemeyer, who's the archivist at the Herbarium, Susan Filter, the art conservator. And this is Amy St. John, Sara Lemmon's great-great-grandniece, and my husband, Dave. And here you can see us all hard at work. And so what exactly is rehousing? Here you can see Amy Filter separating out the different paintings and protecting them with glassine envelopes, and then putting them in large folders so they have plenty of room. Amy St. John is taking the next one that's going to be worked on, and she will be measuring it. And then Amy Kassemeyer, the archivist, is recording the dimensions for the eventual catalog. It took all 5 of us 3 solid days to work through all these, because there were 495 pieces of art. So let's talk more now about the story of Sara Plummer Lemmon herself, for whom, as you all know, Arizona's Mount Lemmon is named. She was born in New Gloucester, Maine, September 3rd, 1836. So day after tomorrow will actually be her 186th birthday. She was the middle child of 5. You already know about her younger sister, Maddie, and she also had 2 older brothers and a younger one. And here are Maddie and father, Sarah's and Maddie's father, Micah Joss Sawyer Plummer. And in those 1,200 pages of letters, there's only one that's directly from Sara to her mother, Betsy Haskell Plummer. And all I know is that Betsy had some significant health problems. At the age of 20, Sara left home to attend the Ladies Collegiate Institute in Worcester, Massachusetts, where she earned a certificate in teaching calisthenics. And that's what we now know as gym class. That's pretty ironic because Sara's health had always been fragile. Then in 1861, she moved to Brooklyn, New York. She graduated from the Greenleaf Female Institute with honors, doubly certified in chemistry and physics. Then in 1862, a year later, she was accepted to the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art. She studied chemistry and physics at night, and during the day, she taught both calisthenics, again, gym, and art, private art lessons. You know, she loved her life in New York City. She was constantly busy teaching, soaking up the intellectual and artistic opportunities, hanging out with progressives. And in a really interesting bit of foreshadowing, she also made time to volunteer at New York's Bellevue Hospital as a nurse for wounded Civil War soldiers. This may be where she crossed paths with Clara Barton for the first time. And of course, Clara Barton would go on to establish the American Red Cross. Again, I find it ironic that Sara would work do volunteer work in a hospital, given her own fragile health. She had terrible respiratory problems. She had bronchitis, constant colds. And then in 1863, she nearly died of measles, which she had probably caught at the hospital. In 1870, she nearly died again, this time of pneumonia, and she realized that her entire life really depended on escaping the bitter northeastern winters. She made the huge decision to move across the country all by herself to California, where she didn't know a single soul. This was not an easy jaunt. The railroad had been established, but it wasn't reliable at this point. So she went the long way around by steamship. She disembarked in San Francisco and stayed there for about a month, and then realized that her lungs were still not up to the Bay Area's cold and damp. So she headed south to Santa Barbara. And when she got there in 1870, the population was 2,970, a little different than it is now. Santa Barbara was lovely. She loved it. The climate was idyllic, especially compared to Manhattan winters. But the intellectual stimulation was a far cry from New York City. And this is when she wrote Maddie, "It's like death to me to be idle." And that almost became the title of the book. But worse yet, there was no library in town. So Sara, being Sara, rounded up donations and hundreds of books, and she established Santa Barbara's first library. As she recovered her health, she took long walks along the beach and in the hills above Santa Barbara. She'd always been insatiably curious, and she taught herself botany by using her artistic ability. This is the earliest surviving painting that we know of so far, but we now know that that can always change. It's most likely a flowering fruit tree, possibly an apple. Those brown spots that you see are called foxing, and they're possibly fungus damage from the humidity in Hawaii, or they might even be tiny rust fragments in the paper. Sara still missed the stimulation of New York City, so she also set up a lecture series, and that may be what brought this man to Santa Barbara. This is John Gill Lemmon, who usually went by J.G. Lemmon. He was born in Michigan in 1832, 4 years before Sara. He became a teacher, and then he became the county superintendent of schools. He started attending classes at the University of Michigan until enlisting in the Union Army in the Civil War in June of 1862. He was in 32 battles in between working as an Army nurse, and then he was captured in August 1864. He was later sent to Florence Stockade in South Carolina, and then the infamous Andersonville prison in Georgia. The photo on the left is J.G. Lemmon, but the one on the right is not. But the one on the right is typical of what the very few survivors of Andersonville looked like when they came out. J.G. was released in 1865 at the end of the war. He wrote later that after, quote, a year of liberal diet, his weight had increased to 90 pounds. And this was a man of 6 feet tall. With his mother's help, J.G. moved to Northern California to convalesce at his brother's home in Sierra Valley. And as a side note, I'm really pleased to tell you that I've been invited to be a part of an arts festival in Sierra Valley later this month. And we're going to be staying at that very ranch, the Lemon Canyon Ranch. J.G. had always been interested in botany, and he began learning the Western plants. The ones that he didn't know, he sent to Harvard University's Dr. Asa Gray, and Asa Gray was the preeminent American botanist at the time. And I call this my bounty of mostly bearded botanists slide. You could think of it as a planetary system with all of these botanists orbiting around Asa Gray. It also helps to have a little context. This was a time of frenetic botanic activity, the 1870s. All of these men were in frequent communication with one another, and you of all audiences will recognize many of their names because they're attached to various plants. By this time, Sara Plummer had educated herself to become really quite a knowledgeable amateur botanist, and both she and J.G. corresponded with them at all. Later on, they often socialized with John Muir and Charles Parry. So it was 1876 that J.G. showed up in Santa Barbara, most likely at a lecture in Sara's library, 2 years after this picture was taken. And he's not exactly a slouch in the whiskers department either. Like Sara, he had terrible health issues, but his were because of his POW experiences during the war. The two of them started botanizing together in the hills above Santa Barbara, and J.G. gradually became smitten with Sara to the point where he asked Asa Gray to name this plant for her, and to this day, it's still called Plummer's Baccharis. A year later, J.G. worked up the courage to propose to Sara, and she turned him down. She said she loved him deeply, but felt they were both too sick too often to marry. So they remained affectionate pen pals for the next several years. And then Sara got sick again with spinal meningitis in 1880. She nearly died yet again, and that or something apparently changed her mind. They were married on Thanksgiving Day, 1880, or as Sara described it to Maddie, they plunged into the matrimonial vortex. And she was 44, he was 48. She relocated from Santa Barbara to Oakland, and she moved in with J.G. and his mother, which apparently worked out fine. They resolved, at Sara's suggestion, that as J.G. wrote later, quote, instead of idling our time in useless saunterings and listening to silly gossip, they would delay their honeymoon until the growing season when they would, quote, make a grand botanical raid into Arizona and try to touch the heart of Santa Catalina. So in April 1881, they arrived in Tucson by train and set up camp in the foothills north of Fort Lowell, which at that time really was indeed a fort. They then spent the next 2 weeks struggling to get to the top of the range from the south side and failed 3 times. And those of you who've driven up there or hiked can certainly understand why you might not be able to hike from Fort Lowell or 6 miles north of Fort Lowell to the top. When I look at this terrain, it's pretty amazing. So they failed getting their goal of getting to the top. They went back to town, regrouped, and within a couple of weeks, they got in touch with Emerson Oliver Stratton, who owned the Pandora Ranch on the north side of the Santa Catalinas. Stratton said he knew a route to the top, and he provided pack animals to the top of the 9,157-foot peak. Later on, he wrote, we went to the highest peak of the Santa Catalinas and christened it Mount Lemmon in honor of Mrs. Lemmon, who was the first white woman up there. In 2019, Dave and I tried to follow their footsteps. Actually, we cheated. We went downhill. We started at Summer Haven and hiked down to Oracle. It was a very, very long day, and we decided the Lemmons are way tougher than we are. Tragically, most of their route, which you can see the dotted line running north to south, burned in 2020's Bighorn Fire. They then went to El Paso and then the Chiricahuas. At that point, it was just too hot for flowering plants, so they came back in the fall. And on this trip, they also spent 3 weeks in Rucker Canyon. They had quite the adventure there, but you'll have to read the book for that one. But while they were in the Fort Bowie area, Sara discovered a new genus, and that's a really big deal in the scientific world. This is an actual specimen of Plummer floribunda, which is in the Smithsonian, and it was named for her by Asa Gray. She was totally delighted and wrote to her father saying that she was so delighted with the honor. Such a fine plant, 2 feet high, that I danced around our big herbarium, overturned the chairs, embraced Lemmonia and mother in the most enthusiastic way. And here, sadly, you can see its new identification. Recent genetic studies show that it's actually not a separate genus after all. It's Hymenopsis ambigens. The following year, which would be 1882, they returned to Arizona, and this time they were based in Fort Huachuca, where they spent several months. Those of you who've read the book already know that this is the time and the place where Sara did most of the surviving paintings, or at least what I thought were most of them until 2 weeks ago. They loved being in the Fort Huachuca area, and they called it a botanical paradise. I think really in many ways, their Arizona adventures were the highlight of their lives together. They camped, and Sara said, I wish you could see our rough outfit of 2 gray rubber blankets, old flannel vests and drawers, old boots and hats, a big lunch basket filled with corned beef, crackers, cheese, and 3 or 4 jars of nice currant jelly. This is a woman after my own heart. She cares about food. There are, as you all know, many plants with the species name Lemmoni, or Lemmonii. But these are a few of the Arizona plants that are named specifically for Sara, and like this one of Plummer's cliff fern. But it's also worth remembering that in 1884, Asa Gray made it clear that, quote, whenever the name of lemon is cited for Arizonian plants, it in fact refers to the pair of most enthusiastic botanists. So here's another one, the Plummer's Morning Glory. And the very first specimen was collected by Sara in 1882. And here's another one, Plummer's Candy Leaf. This is a stevia, the same group of plants you use to sweeten your tea. And here's a euphorbia. Sadly, this one has also lost its nomenclature connection to Sara because it's now called Anisophyllum macropus. This one is, however, still Allium plumera, and its common name is Tanner's onion in the garlic group. So here's one that's not named for Sara, but is another specimen that was actually collected by her from the Huachucas. And Dave and I were actually able to see the actual specimen while visiting the Nebraska State Museum. The Lemmons sent their specimens all over the world. This particular one is Eutropha mycorrhiza. It's a nettle spurge, and it has a label in Sara's distinctive handwriting. And I can tell you that after reading 1,200 pages of her handwriting, I'm pretty familiar with it. Also notice that Sara is simply identified as and wife. I'll spare you the feminist rant, except to say, you know, that was typical of the times. And now actually several authorities believe that it was actually Sara who did much of the botanical work that was credited to JG because he was so devastated by his war wounds. Here's a picture of the actual plant and the Palencios. And here's her painting of it. This one is in the book, and you can see that it's signed. You have to look carefully, but it's signed on the bottom. And you can also see quite a lot of foxing on this one. On the back, it says that she did it in Fort Huachuca, and this is again in her handwriting, June, July, 1882. This one's also in the book. I think this one is just really lovely. They're all my favorites. I can't pick just one. This one was done in September in the Huachucas. Tanner's Canyon is the old name for Gardner Canyon. And another one that has a little bit of foxing on it. This one was done July 4th. So the following year, by now we're up to 1883, they returned to Arizona, and this time they went to both the Catalinas and the Huachucas. Sara wrote later that they stayed on the Cactus Ranch north of Tucson, but they were poisoned by the well water. So they left that area and they wanted to go back to Fort Huachuca, but there was an outbreak of yellow fever there. So instead they stayed at the Igo Ranch on the north end of the Huachucas. And here is one of the newly discovered paintings. This is, I think, the common name, and I should say here at some point, I am not a botanist. And sometimes the names that Sara identified a plant as, the spelling has changed or the entire name has changed. But it's identified on the back where she wrote, it's painted in the Santa Catalina region, 1883. And all her notes in the back are written very lightly in pencils, and they can be very challenging to read. With this one, I've enhanced it in Photoshop, bumped up the contrast. And so you can see Santa Catalina region, September 1883, and her signature. And Ingenhausia is now spelled with a Z. And here's another newly discovered paintings. This is Pringles cluster vine. Here's a photograph of the actual plant. And here's her notes on the back, where she wrote Santa Catalina Mountains, September 1883, and she signed it and identified it as Jacomatia Pringles Eye in Box Canyon, Santa Catalina Mountains, September 3rd, 1883. And she also, let me go backwards, because she also refers to the purple morning glory. And it would be wonderful to know if that's the same purple morning glory that was later named for her. I don't think we'll ever know. Here's one of my favorite flowers, the Mexican star. And with it, she's combined blue grama grass. And I know that because on the back, if you read, and I don't know what she had here, this part was cut off, but I would have loved to have seen it because it's Ruellia. But she's written White Flowers, Milla by Flora, Igo's Ranch, Huachuca Mountains, September 18th, 1883, and again signed it. And then she's identified what she calls fringe grass as Butyloa oligostachys. And here's the real plant. In 1884, they were on the train from California, and they happened to meet a man named John Willard Young. He was the son of Brigham Young, who'd built Fort Moroni, and he invited them to stay at his ranch for the summer. They remained his guests there, and that was where Sara painted this plant, the whole-leafed Indian paintbrush, Castanea integra. And this one is actually in the book because this is part of the first, that 276 paintings. And on the back, she wrote Kendricks Mountain, Northern Arizona, 1884. That same year, they traveled on to New Orleans because Sara was in charge of organizing the entire Pacific Slope section of what was then known as, it's a mouthful, World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition, known to most of us as the World's Fair. They spent 6 months in New Orleans, and they spent most of their spare time hanging out with Clara Barton and her field agent, Dr. Julian Hubble, and they had all by this time become very good friends and would remain so. Here's another new treasure from last month's work. This is the original, it's all kind of curled up still, signed certificate appointing Sara as the commissioner of the exhibit. Mrs. J.G. Lemmon has been appointed commissioner of the Women's Department of the California exhibit at, and then the very long name of the World's Fair. So I was very excited to see this because she had written her family about it. And I thought it had been lost. So I was just so excited to see this. Here's another highlight in the lives of this supposedly frail couple. Astoundingly, they decided to become homesteaders. And thanks to the wonders of the internet, I was able to locate a map of their actual claim. And Dave and I traveled there in 2019. And in an amazing stroke of good luck and timing, which I like referring to as serendipity, we were able to get permission to walk the actual land. And this dead walnut right here is right next to the spring that Sara mentions in one of her letters. They first set up camp in a canvas tent, but the second day they were there, they went off to get firewood, and somebody set fire to the tent and burned almost everything they had. Again, Sara, being a frugal type, used what was left of her paper for stationery, and they ordered wood from San Luis Obispo and built a 10 by 20 or 10 by 12 cabin by hand. And she wrote her family about the fire, about the cabin, and included a sketch of the one they built. This area is near Chelan, and in Central California. From then on, for the rest of their lives, they were generally out in the field during the growing season, collecting plants. They then spent winters at their herbarium in Oakland, eking out a living by selling specimens and seeds to collectors. They produced several books, all illustrated by Sara, and did frequent botany lectures. In 1903, they packed everything up from their rental house and moved into what would become their own home, their last place that they would live. This photo always makes me feel much better about the mess in my office. So here's the home from the outside. If you look really carefully, you can see here that it says Lemmon Herbarium. It's on Telegraph Avenue in Oakland. And astoundingly, the house is still standing. This picture is from last year, and amazingly, it's still there. Let me go back so that you can compare them. Telegraph Avenue looks a little different, and the house could use some love. Sara remained passionate about healthcare. She was very active in the Red Cross. She wrote the history of the Pacific Slope Red Cross, which was no small accomplishment. It's 486 pages with many, many photos. And I also discovered that she quietly established the first training school for nurses on the West Coast. She was a frequent speaker about the importance of forest conservation, and she also spoke often at women's suffrage events. If you ask a Californian, they would probably tell you that her most well-known accomplishment, since they don't have a mountain named for her, was in 1903 after a 10-year battle when the golden poppy was named California's state flower. In June of 1905, the Lemmons returned to Tucson. They hunted up Emerson Stratton, and the following month, the three of them retraced their steps on 5 burros in honor of J.G. and Sara's 25th wedding anniversary. And she wrote, it's hard to read, but at the bottom of the postcard, she says, "Both well and happy on this, our silver wedding journey. We sleep in the open air beside a delicious mountain stream that sings our nightly lullaby." And I like to think that that was where Summerhaven now is. By now, Sara had made hundreds and hundreds of paintings, and the big question is, where are they? And I'm afraid I might have an answer to that question, a partial answer. Sara was the second female member of the, until then, all-male California Academy of Sciences. She was then the first woman allowed to speak to the group, and after breaking through that barrier, she was at the Academy Herbarium frequently. In their letters, both she and J.G. often referred to sending their specimens there, as well as many of her illustrations. And at 5:12 a.m. on April 18th, the San Francisco earthquake convulsed the Bay Area and more. As if the earthquake wasn't enough, fires gutted the California Academy of Science. I still believe that much of Sara's work went up in flames there, but I'm ecstatic to have been proven at least partially wrong. Sara wrote her family, "We are safe, though tremendously shaken." And both Sara and John were shattered by the loss of so much of their work. JG's health, which was already fragile, continued to decline over the next year, and he lost much of his vision. He then died of pneumonia in November 1908, 2 days before their 28th wedding anniversary. After he was gone, Sara never really recovered. In fact, her sister Maddie believed that Sara's cognitive decline began with the trauma of the earthquake. The family committed Sara to Stockton State Hospital on April 22nd, 1916, ironically, the day that would later become Earth Day. The diagnosis was dementia. I find the whole thing just terribly tragic. She became, as they said, profane, and this distinguished, elegant, brilliant woman had to be prevented from leaving the house unclad, was their description. She died January 15th, 1923, and the two of them are buried together in Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland under a gravestone that reads Partners in Botany. I love that. So what about her artistic legacy? Some of her illustrations are in the books they produced together, but they're all reproduced in black and white. Interestingly, this particular one, How to Tell the Trees, is copyrighted in Sara's name. Here's a narrow leaf pine from one of JG's books about the pines of the Pacific Slope. But I've been wondering for years, where are the original paintings for these illustrations? Well, here's one of them that showed up in one of the boxes that we were able to see last month. In 1888, the Lemmons traveled to Mexico in search of Parry's nut pine, the conifer that she described in an article for the San Diego newspaper, and that's in the book. You'll notice, interestingly, that this dark paper does not age well. And so the illustrations, the paintings that are on dark paper are particularly fragile. Here's another one that showed up 2 weeks ago. And you can see again how incredibly fragile it is. Even just moving these sometimes makes them just crack apart. I was interested with this smear on the upper left. And if you enlarge it and turn it sideways, it says Mrs. S.A.P. Lemmon. It's a little hard to read that, really hard to read this. Could be August 1884. I'm not sure we'll ever know. I could happily keep you here all day looking at all these paintings, but I do want to save time for questions. So this is the last one that I'll show you. This one is a Downy Evening Primrose. And I know that because when you enlarge the label on the bottom, it says Downy Evening Primrose, Enithera trichocalyx, Colorado River near Fort Mojave, Mrs. J.G. Lemmon. So now that the book is out, some people might think I should be done with Sara, but actually all along I've thought of my life with Sara Lemmon more as a project, not just a book. And it now appears that Sara and I are going to be joined for quite a while longer. Dave says that he feels as if he's married two women, both Sara and me. And with this recent discovery of 200 plus paintings that we didn't know about, this phase 2 section of preserving the artwork is going to continue. At the moment, it's on hold because we blew through the money of the first donations. And so it's on hold until I get more funding. If you have any suggestions about agencies, foundations, interest groups, or individuals who'd like to collaborate financially on this project, and please do let me know. And my email address is wynne@wynnebrown.com, and Rick has probably already added that to the chat box. So one way, there are several initiatives that have already started for phase 3. Promotional activities could continue. There's botanical illustration groups who are on board. There are people working on curricular materials that would combine botany and Sara's life. Another possibility would be an online catalog raisonné. A catalog raisonné is a very high resolution catalog. My feeling is it would be great if it would be online because printing is so expensive. And if it were online, everybody could see it. Another possibility would be getting high resolution scans of some of these paintings, maybe digitally restoring them, and then those scans could travel and be exhibited. Any ideas that anybody has are also very, very welcome. If you'd like to be kept informed about this project, I do send out a newsletter. I try not to send it very often, but each one has snippets about Sara. It is free, and I try to only send it out if I have something to announce. So for example, this is the one that went out yesterday, reminding people about today's event. and also describing the work that we did in the herbaria this past 2 weeks. The book is available wherever you buy books. As Amy said earlier, I've been encouraging people to support our local independent bookstores. Both Mostly Books and Antigone's usually have it in stock, or they can certainly order it for you. And for those of you who do buy it, if you'd like a signed copy, if you'll email me, I'm happy to send you a signed book plate that you can put in your book. So that's where the Sara Lemmon project is, at least for now. And I hope you agree with me that Sara is really another hidden figure of both science and art, and that she so deserves to have a mountain in her name, and she deserves to have a book, and that her work deserves to be preserved. Again, Skyline Alliance, Amy, thank you so much for inviting me. And at this point, I'm very happy to unshare my screen, if I can remember how to do that, and take any questions.
Wow, wow, wow. That was fascinating on so many levels. And thank you so much, Wynne, for just a really great presentation. And I'm sure beyond myself that everyone joining us from Tucson, and we have folks joining us from Sonora, Mexico, California, Seattle, Kansas City, all the way to North Carolina today. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. And the one thing that I took away and will carry with me for quite some time is that, you know, despite her being so ill, over the course of her life, she still accomplished so much. And that resonated with me as I'm undergoing treatment for cancer. So it's just hopeful and lovely. So thank you for that. We do have some questions, and if you want to ask a question, please make sure you pop it in the chat so that we can moderate that. I'll kick it off with one. One thing I wanted to know is your thoughts, Wynne, on why the botany community took so long to recognize Sara Plummer Lemmon's work, and why it has taken, you know, why has no one written about her until now?
That's a really good question. I think a lot of it has to do with, for so many years, women didn't have the respect as scientists. I really think of Sara as one of the very early proto-ecologists. But there just wasn't a lot of material that was available. And if it hadn't been for her descendant saving all these letters, and this would be my plea to everybody to, you know, to take really good care of what you find in your attic, because it's a treasure. And those letters that really explained how so much of her life really made it possible. And in her case, her husband was so much more famous, and people really were interested in his experiences in the Civil War. He wrote voluminously. There are many, many folders of his letters as well. And so there was much more of a focus on that. And in those days, as I said in the presentation, the women botanists were often referred to and wife. There were certainly some notable exceptions. You know, Kate Brandegee, Alice Eastwood, but Sara really predated them just a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for that. There was also some love in the chat for your office help. What's the office help's name?
Her full name is Chiaroscuro, which is the name that refers in Renaissance art to the interplay of light and dark. Because of her coat color, we call her Cairo. She's very, very well. if I'd known that we were going to be that, she's a rescue, and I had suggested the name before we knew that we were going to be the ones to have to spell it all the time. But she's very well traveled. All of these following Sarah's footsteps trips have been driving, and she travels with us. She's now done 27,000 miles with us in the last 3 years.
That's amazing. It's good to have good help.
It is hard to find good help. Yeah.
So question from the chat, did you develop insight into why and how Sara and her husband were able to find the energy to sustain their active life of hiking, exploring, and traveling to distant, undeveloped, and dangerous places when they both literally had one foot on a banana peel health-wise?
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. I think the driving characteristic, particularly for Sara, was resilience, actually two, resilience and curiosity. They just were determined to see what was around the next corner, I'd say, of the trail, except there were no trails. And they were determined to find out these plants. Plus, at the time, people were really driven to try to find new plants. And some of it was egotistical because they wanted them named for themselves. But all over the country, people were scrambling up and down trees and whacking off chunks of bark and cutting down pine cones and digging up plants. And in some cases, with ferns, fern was just a mania, pteridomania, I think is its technical term. They almost put some ferns out of existence because they were so eager to collect. So that's kind of the downside of some of this. People really had no idea of the distribution of some of these plants and had no idea that some of them might have been rare. So that was some of it. But they just had incredible determination and drive.
Yeah. And like I said earlier, just really super inspiring to me, and I'm sure others. I did see some discussion in the chat about handling of the artwork and using gloves. And do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, that surprised me the very first time. I made 3 trips to Berkeley, and the first time I didn't know about the art, and I was just handling the letters, and I was surprised that I wasn't told to handle them with gloves. What archivists have discovered is that there's less risk to the actual artifact if people handle it with bare hands. Yes, you might have oil, although they ask you to wash your hands before handling anything. But with gloves, even the very thin cotton gloves, people tend to not be able to quite get a grip on it, and it's more likely to break off a corner of the painting or the letter. So yes, all of us use bare hands. The masks are because of COVID, not because of breathing on the artwork. We were interested walking around on the Berkeley campus. It was the first day of the freshmen returning, and everybody wore masks, even outside. It's not required to wear a mask inside the Berkeley buildings, but I found that pretty interesting.
Yeah, agreed. So another question from the chat is, did the Lemmons have live specimens in their herbarium, or were they just dead or dried samples of what they found?
Most of them were dried samples. And another thing to think about, as I'm looking out my window at the south-facing slope of the Catalinas, they were hauling plant presses. So they're hauling sheets of wood and blotting paper and straps to hold them together, and then bags of damp rags to be able to try to keep the ferns in some kind of shape until they could get them back. They did have some living specimens. They brought back a plant that's now called Lemmon's Mountain Marigold. It's Tagetes lemmoni, and they were the first ones to find it up in the Santa Catalinas. They took that live ones back to California, and that was actually the beginning of the nursery stock of the plants that we still buy as Tagetes lemoni. And I have one actually right outside my window where it can see where its ancestral home was. They do very well in Tucson, especially on the north side and with irrigation. They have a very, very strong smell, which I love, but not everybody does.
Great, thank you. And then one last question and then we'll wrap up. Can you speak maybe generally? I'm sure you could talk for a very long time, but it seems like this work that you've done has really changed your life and transformed it. And even you mentioned, my husband says I'm married to 3 people. You know, what do you take away personally from this work?
That's another good question. You know, as you mentioned, I really find Sara inspirational. I mean, her drive, her resilience when things get tough, and her curiosity and her willingness to take risks. I mean, just leaving everything she knew back east and going to a totally new place to reinvent herself. I just find inspirational, and for some reason, she grabbed me, and I think part of it is because I've been a scientific illustrator, and her writing is absolutely wonderful. And I think that intersection of interests, that kind of Venn diagram of science and art and words, is something that just grabbed me early on, and it just won't let go. And apparently she and I are going to be joined for a while longer, which is a good thing.
It's a very good thing. And we thank you for your dedication and your work and your future work in preserving and supporting the legacy of Sara Plummer Lemmon. Thank you so much. And thank you for your talk today.
Oh, thank you. And thank you to Sky Island Alliance for all the work that you do for our land. I'm so proud to be a member and a contributor. Thank you. And thank you everybody for being here. So fun to see these familiar names. And take care.
All over the country, and apparently lots of people reading in the process of reading and to be reading your book. So this is wonderful. So we'll wrap up. Thank you for joining. Please do look up Getting and Reading Wynne's book, and she did mention Antiquity Books and Bookman's here in Tucson, or look up your local bookstore. You can check out our event page at skyislandsalliance.org to get up to date on upcoming coffee breaks, talks, events, and volunteer opportunities. And you can support our conservation work in the Skylands region at skyislands.org/donate. And we hope you'll join us in whatever way works for you. Both Wynne and I will be bopping around the Chiricahua Palacios. How do you pronounce that?
Palacios, you had it.
Palacios Heritage Days in Rodeo, New Mexico. And you can find more information on that on our events page. And we also do have an upcoming photofauna training that you can register for and find out more information on. What a great day. And I think we'll just sign off and say thank you so much for joining us today. And I know we have a lot to think about in the days ahead from this talk. So
thank you so much.